This episode on Veganics is about a year in the making. Last January, I was in Southern California to speak at the Greenflower Media Cannabis Entrepreneur Summit. After the first day of the event, there was this incredible VIP party at the home of Aaron and Erica Justice. Aaron and Erica are the owners of Bud and Rose's Cannabis Dispensary in Los Angeles. The party in a gated community was packed with seriously major players in the legal cannabis industry all across the country. There was this amazing spread of food, and the view of the mountains off their lanai was just incredible. The reason I mention this party is because they had this cannabis bar there with an array of flowers grown and sold by the Bud and Rose's dispensary. You could do dabs, or the bartender would pack you a bowl or roll you a joint or whatever. It was all, very pleasant. The thing, though, is that each of the jars were filled with incredible specimens of each strain. For example, the strawberry cough I had was the best strawberry cough I had ever tasted. Similarly, the black lime was the best lime I had ever tasted. And as I went down the line of jars, the various flowers had exceptional terpene profiles, and the ones I went ahead and toked had a flavor that came right through the smoke, even though I was combusting and not vaping. That's when I had my first veganically grown cannabis. I knew of some folks that had experimented on and off with Veganics, and I had heard folks talk about how clean the tastes were, but I was really, really impressed and caught off guard. So I decided that I needed to do a show about Veganics, both so I could learn about it and because I figured other people would be interested too. So off I went to find a guest for the show on Veganics. Obviously Kyle Cushman is at the top of that list because he puts out his line of bottled veganic inputs. But I really wanted to do a show more from a do-it-yourself probiotic direction. And if Kyle was on the show, there'd be so many other cool things to talk about that we might not even ever get to veganic growing. So I searched the internet for a while and never really found the right person to interview. Everyone used to grow veganic, but now they include worm castings at least, and some much more, like even fish guts. So eventually I went to my favorite place to learn about probiotic growing, and I posted for guest suggestions on the Probiotic Farmers Alliance group on Facebook. Most everyone's comment was that Veganics was not a thing, and that some animal inputs were absolutely a necessity. But then Alan Adkisson of Grokashi posted that there's this one guy to talk to who is an old school probiotic grower, breeder, and High Times writer, and his name was Nebu. That's Nebu. So it took me a few weeks to find Nebu in the underground, but I did find him growing and working in Oregon. And he's my guest today on Shaping Fire. I'm your host, Shango Los, and today we're going to talk about veganic growing and whether or not it's still a thing. Welcome to the show, Nebu.
Thanks for having me, Shango.
I'm so glad that you could make some time to be on the show. So, we know that organic growing or natural growing is how it always was before synthetic fertilizers came about. And then, the time of better living through chemistry happened and organic natural growing got usurped by synthetics and chemicals and petroleum inputs. But nowadays, we're starting to come back around to probiotic growing and living soil and nutrient teas. What was the reigning headspace when you first started writing for High Times?
I think that's a pretty accurate observation. I've seen some memes where they show black and white pictures and they say everything was grown organic back in the day. And that's true. And then I think the reigning kind of space when I first started with High Times was a lot of synthetics, salt-based fertilizers, be it, hydro. Hydro was huge. And you can do organic in hydro, but it's not very convenient. It's a little bit difficult and challenging. So the synthetics were kind of it. I mean, they were the big thing. So it's kind of like bypassing all the symbiotic relationship that happens with the microbiome and just giving them, straight injections of nutrients that are already broken down and can, penetrate the rhizosphere.
Yeah, I can imagine that breaking everything down in its individuality. I mean, you get the basic components, but you don't get the song.
It's kind of like force feeding, yeah, and it's not the symbiotic relationship that happens naturally. So, you can overfeed really easily. You can burn, and you're missing something here and there, and ultimately it reflects in the quality, and that's why you see it at farmers markets or wherever you go, the grocery store. There's a big push for organics, not only because of the ethical considerations and how it impacts the environment, but really the quality of the product is superior. It's just you can't really argue against all the years of evolution, So I think the quality is really key.
Specifically on the quality, I mean, I'm a big fan of probiotic flour, but what would you say are the data points of quality that sets probiotic flours apart?
Well, and that's going to be a difficult thing because I don't think it'll reflect in a lot of the tests, and there's going to have to be a big paradigm shift because people are looking like at THC percent and they're thinking about it as alcohol percent. Oh my God, this flour has 30% THC. I'm going to get completely blotto. And what they're not looking at is terpenes and all the entourage endocannabinoids that are there, and it's another symbiotic relationship that they all work together. And you can't test for sativa versus indica. There's no test that really tells you the effect that it's going to have. So what I've found is, and what I've always bred for and grown for, is really the flavor and the profile, of course, but because I've always been against the kind of couch lock. I mean, there's a time and place for it for indicas. If you want that really sedative type of effect, there's definitely a place for it. But during the daytime, I like to have sativas, and those are more difficult to grow. They also yield less and whatnot. But I guess I'm getting kind of far afield here, but just to bring it back, what I've noticed is just the flavor. I would say, in a nutshell, if you had to boil it down to one thing, it's just the flavor, the taste, and the overall profile.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the negative inflected term salts for bottled nutrients already. And, in researching Veganics for this show, a lot of people were talking, the kind of people who are into Veganics and probiotics, they talk a lot of trash about bottled nutrients. Would you talk a little bit to why bottled nutrients are something that people are turning away from? I mean, we've talked about it being the individuated parts, but why may not that be as successful as building probiotic communities in the soil?
Again, it's just boils down to a simple concept. It's life. Probiotic, that means life. That's if you follow the Latin roots, that's what it means. So that's what it's all about when you want to grow in a natural environment, is having those having that symbiosis, having those bacteria and all the beneficial microorganisms that help break down and work there, the mycorrhizae, fungal bacteria that grow roots or even grow mushrooms. They all work together in a symbiotic fashion, and you can't really get that in a bottle. It's deprived of oxygen, and it will die. I mean, you can bottle it and it will last for a little while, but shelf life is very, very short on those. These bacteria are sort of sensitive. They need that environment that nurtures them. So that's something that you can't really get from a bottle. You can get a lot of food that you can feed the bacteria from a bottle. So you can get your guanos and everything else from a bottle and feed that to them. But you can't really get the life from the bottle.
I remember when I was first starting to learn about growing in the early 90s, all anybody wanted to talk to me about was NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And they're like, if you got those three, pump that plant full of them, you're good to go. And now, as I've matured into my understanding of cannabis, I've realized that there's this whole community of inputs that need to be there, and how they make each other more accessible to the plant.
That is completely true, and you can grow decently with those. And people have produced decent plants with that. And then they talk about flushing, which is something that's trying to get the salt fertilizers out of the plant before you harvest. And that's just not a necessary step when you're growing organic. What are you going to flush? You don't need to flush anything. So all that has come from that NPK, that chemical salt-based fertilizer centric paradigm. And it's really just not necessary. And you can see it, like if somebody doesn't flush and you're burning, I vaporize, so you can't tell as well. But if you're burning a flower, I actually had an old friend of mine convince me to trade him some, and I still regret it to this day. But it was back when I was still combusting, and instead of it burning to ash, it kind of just melted into this black kind of chunk of coal.
Oh,
and I think that was just all. It was horrible. I couldn't even touch it. So that was all the salts just burning and melting. And yeah, so obviously not natural, obviously a lot less healthy, I would imagine.
Yeah, totally. Well, now that we've given a little context for folks about, where the idea of veganics lives, let's get right into the heart of the matter. While I know you have some reservations about veganic growing long term, let's set those aside for a moment. We'll talk about those a little bit later. But for now, would you go ahead and make the case for veganic growing as people see it? Why do people consider avoiding animal inputs?
I think, and unfortunately for us, I think that is an ethical concern, and that's kind of touchy because everybody has to make their own personal decisions, whether it's their diet or how they grow their plant or anything else to that effect. And I think that's where the incentive for veganics lies, and that they just don't want to use any animal products. Now, you have to make some concessions with that choice because microorganisms and protozoa and everything that go in there that are beneficial are still considered part of veganics. But in the ethical evaluation, they're saying that they don't have a consciousness or they don't have a nervous system, so it's okay. Now, to me, that's getting a little tenuous. But again, I'm making my own personal decisions. I want to have the optimal environment for the plant. And plants can and will thrive without any animal inputs. Obviously, if you look at the evolution of our planet, plants were first. They did fine. But if you're walking along your path in Hawaii, for instance, and you see all these plants just doing lush, and all of a sudden you come across a place where a cow died years ago, and it's all of a sudden 10 times as lush right there because it's feeding the plants. So it's hard to argue against input. So I kind of take the ethical avenue of looking more at mitigating waste and being efficient. So instead of just throwing everything away, like let's say all the compost or all the byproduct from your organic dairy production is just going to get pushed away, or you have all this extra fish left over, they're just going to throw it away. I would actually advocate more for using those animal products, using vermiculture, and using those because I believe that provides a more optimal environment. But I can completely relate to the incentive for veganics based on an ethical perspective.
Right on. Well, some of the people that I talk to who are into veganic growing, they're not necessarily doing it for the moral, ethical reasons. They say they do it because they think they're getting a healthier plant. And, I must admit, I come to this topic with a little bit of skepticism myself anyway, because I'm a big believer in earthworm castings. And so what is the argument that veganic folks make that a plant will be healthier and more thriving without using animal products? I mean, is the idea that the animal products in those proponents' mind somehow is a take from the plant, or make somehow some sort of nutrient less available to the plant?
Well, I haven't had a good argument with somebody who's a real strong advocate of veganics, but what I understand is they make the argument that it's cleaner. Now, that's a pretty ambiguous statement to make, and I would, any statement that you're making, especially now in the day of it, that we can do testing for fungus and everything else, and don't have to stay, as we did in Prohibition, kind of under the radar. Now you can bring it out and actually test for these things. So I'd like to see those claims backed up, because I don't really see it. The roots are going to take in what they take. It's not like you're coating the plant with all kinds of, well, actually you do if you're doing foliar feeding, but the plants assimilate that, and that's the whole probiotic approach, is that the foliar feeding and the root feeding, it's all feeding the plant, so it breaks it down. But I don't see veganics as being cleaner. I don't see any scientific evidence to support that. Now there could be, I'm sorry to interrupt you, there could be empirical evidence. I mean, maybe, and I haven't seen a side by side. I tested it myself and was growing that way for a while, just to see how it would work, because I felt a little responsibility since I was writing for High Times at the time, and I wanted to test these things to see how viable they were, although I wasn't necessarily advocating it. But I can also see it, like if somebody's immunocompromised, say, and they don't want to be around any animal products because they don't want to risk having that bacteria Yeah, I can understand that too. So there's a lot of reasons that people could make that individual choice, but I don't see it, the quality argument as being valid.
Right on.
That's my opinion.
Yeah, right on. Well, that's why you're here. You know, I'm starting to get the idea between the research I did in advance and chatting with you and others that you know, a lot of the people who go to Veganics, it may be for outside reasons, either moral, ethical, or maybe because they're immune compromised and they don't want to have animal products. They don't want to work with them themselves with their hands, or something else. And I'm realizing that to a certain degree, Veganics may be kind of like its own response to not wanting to use bottled nutrients. Like it is obviously Veganics is a subset of probiotic growing, but maybe it's just, you know, the more hardcore version, a hardcore reaction against salt and synthetics. And that's an interesting idea.
That could be. You know, it's kind of being defined as we go. So, you know, I guess the people who are doing it and advocating it are defining it as they go. As I did when I wrote the Higher Organics article in High Times in 2004, I was just kind of putting a definition out there, and obviously these definitions can evolve. The way I look at it, the Veganics isn't necessarily probiotic. It won't work without probiotics, I would argue, but it's not necessarily probiotic. In fact, that adds living creatures, which if you're a pure vegan, and I know that they make exceptions for this because, again, that they're saying that these microflora do not have nervous systems and whatnot. But I mentioned I've written and advocated about a book by Clive Baxter, which is called Primary Perception, and he's tested plants actually and found that they do have feelings, you could say. And this is probably a kind of an in-depth topic for another discussion, but he tested them with a lie detector and found feedback. And in a nutshell, you can read more about that. But you know, perhaps there's communication and feeling happen that we're not aware of, even in vegetative creatures, you know, you could say. So there's, I don't know, it just gets a little fuzzy when you start talking about the ethics of it.
Yeah, right on. I follow that. So, hey, we're late for our first break. We're going to go to our first short break and be right back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. Using pesticides when growing cannabis has been common for a long time. Nowadays, though, we know better. We know that most pesticides formulated for food crops have never been tested for use with cannabis. They've been tested to be eaten in tiny doses. They have not been tested to be inhaled and especially not concentrated into a cannabis oil. Chemical residues from pesticides are not healthy for anyone, but they are especially dangerous for patients. For commercial cannabis growers, this has become very impactful. Cannabis enthusiasts and patients have gotten educated enough that they avoid growers who used pesticides. Not only that, but states across the country have begun making pesticide testing mandatory on all licensed cannabis crops. The time has come to find a better way to fight garden pests than covering your cannabis in chemicals. And there is a better way. Let some good bugs fight your bad bugs. Beneficial insects and predatory mites have come a long way since we were buying ladybugs online and putting them in the grow room and just hoping for the best. Natural Enemies Biocontrol can help you solve pest issues without using chemicals. Natural Enemies founder Shane Young learned best practices from working in the ornamental plant industry and has fine-tuned those strategies specifically for large cannabis crops. Shane works with commercial cannabis clients across the country to ensure that they keep their crops safe and pest-free without the use of chemicals. Natural Enemies has proven solutions for spider mites, aphids, thrips, russet mites, broad mites, shore flies, whitefly, and others too. You can rely on Natural Enemies for expertise and excellent service. For more information, go to shapingfire.com/natural enemies or simply click on their banner in this week's newsletter. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I am your host, Shango Los. And our guest this week is legendary probiotic grower and High Times writer, Nebu. So Nebu, before the break, we were talking about veganics as an idea that some people have used, and some people have used it as a bridge towards probiotics as they move away from the bottle, and this idea of veganics that has lasted for a while. And I got to tell you, when I was researching the show, trying to find an expert to bring on, pretty much the only person that came up anywhere was Kyle Cushman. And as I dug more and more, and I asked my compatriots there on the Probiotic Farmers Alliance group on Facebook, about who they would recommend, your name came up. And so I had to, hunt you up,
I appreciate that,
and find out where you were. And the thing is that, veganics seems like this thing that has just kind of always been there maybe, but it hasn't really gotten popular, and there aren't very many people evangelizing it anymore. So my question for you is, did veganics ever become popular, or has it always been this kind of minor specialty ideology?
Yeah, I think it's been pretty minor. I didn't know. I mean, after I wrote about it in 2004, I don't think anybody that I know of was actually doing it. And I know Kyle started his company around it, but that was, a decade later, or, it was quite a bit later. So I haven't seen it be a really popular thing. But I think, it's a good thing if it stays true to all the other positive aspects of growing. And when you talk about shipping soil and things like that, you in plastic bags, and the trucking and all that, you reach the point of diminishing returns on the benefit of it pretty quickly, as opposed to if you can do it yourself.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I got to admit, the more we talk about this, I think that my understanding of veganics is evolving. When we came to the show, I was kind of expecting this show to be making a case for veganics that people could either take or leave. But what I'm starting to realize is that, veganics is almost like a straw man. Like, yeah, veganics is way better than using bottled nutrients. And yet you might not have the best thriving plants as if you used some animal inputs. But really, it sounds like, it's almost like a straw man, a foil to have a discussion around, that it might not actually be, a cogent strategy in and of itself, but more like an inroad to probiotics and using nutrient teas.
I agree. Yeah, I can see it as being a stepping stone, as it were, for some folks. And I think when you introduce all the creatures, again, it kind of goes against the veganic principles, because now you're dealing with animal products. And I guess my concept and my principles are just, I want to provide everything I can, obviously ethically, to nurture the plant as much as possible. And it seems counterproductive to me to get away from all the creatures that have evolved around it, whether it's vermiculture using seabird guano, bat guanos, fish emulsion. All those things, those are just tools that will really, really provide life for your plants and really help them thrive. So I don't have the ethical concerns or hang-ups or whatever you want to call it that I need to, or the immune system that I'm worried about. In fact, I'm very probiotic in my own health. So I don't need to worry about any of those things in my own personal grow. But again, I can see how people do it, and I say kudos to them. I think it's a good thing if they're doing it themselves. Now, if you're buying bags and bags of fertilizer, having them shipped in, it's all dead, it's in plastic, then I really don't see any ethical advantage to that. But again, it could still be an immune system concern. So if you have to have a real sterile environment for yourself, that is unfortunate, because a sterile environment is the perfect environment for pathogens to evolve. Even our own bodies, the ratio of bacteria to human cells, we have more bacteria than human cells in our own biome, and that's something that you need to feed and nurture. And our health is dependent upon that. Same with the plant. The phyllosphere, the leaf surface is alive. If you populate that with compost teas, you will not have the diseases like powdery mildew won't be able to start as much if you have a good foliar feeding regimen. And same with the rhizosphere, the root zone. If you're feeding that, you're getting the symbiotic relationship of breaking down all the nutrients, and it's just giving the plant everything it needs. So if I'm drawing on animal and vegetable, I will really draw on everything, that I can. Now, I'm not like sacrificing animals or doing anything, crazy, but if it's a waste product, especially that I'm taking advantage of, then I feel very good about it. And the plants show it.
Right on. That makes sense. Let's dig into that bit about why the plants are doing better with animal inputs. So I recognize that you're potentially going to go over my head here, since I still consider myself a novice grower compared to somebody like you who's been doing it for 30 years or more. But so let's talk a little bit about the biochemistry behind it. So when you're not using animal inputs, what is being missed at the micro level that the plant is looking for that it can get from worm castings and using extra fish guts and things like that you might throw into your hole. What is the plant pulling from these nutrient wise that it's not going to pull from pure plant sources?
Again, that goes to the symbiotic relationship of the like nitrogen fixing bacteria, all the different bacteria, or the mycorrhizae. Well, I guess the fungi isn't considered a creature, but I would have to consider the bacteria and the nematodes and all those things as creatures, and all the bacteria that goes with them, all the life that goes with it, helps break down a lot of the nutrients. Some of them are already bioavailable, but it's all about bioavailability, and that's all those bacteria and all those creatures add to that.
Right on. That makes sense to me. And so if the goal was to produce, we were kind of throwing around the term clean product earlier. If one wanted to use animal inputs, and yet they still wanted to try to respect producing a clean product like somebody who had a veganic mindset, was trying to attain. What are some of the better animal inputs that could be used that both have a symbiotic relationship with the soil, but also won't sludge up your soil?
Yeah, I would say I would focus on your community, let's say. So you're on Vashon Island, right? Let's say that you've got maybe a relationship with an organic dairy there, and you want to start vermiculture. So you take all the droppings from the cows and all the manure and everything, and then you feed that to your worm bin, and they process it. That is going to, when it's done, it's going to be so beneficial for your soil. And let's say you have some relationships established with fisheries, and instead of them throwing away the fish heads and the bones or whatever parts they don't use, you can emulsify that, and then you could use that in your compost teas as well as your other, it's kind of the biodynamic approach. You use everything you can. Now there's going to be other considerations, especially now since Fukushima happened. You may be a little bit cautious about using those fish. You might want a little Geiger counter there to see. It's sad to have to consider that, but there maybe that's another bonus for Veganics, because as the radioactive particles become bioaccumulated in the food chain, that's going to be something that people have to consider more and more. It's unfortunate. I hate to bring that up, but there's been studies, and I mean, there were 3 total meltdowns that happened, and now they're seeing the cesium signature, right on the shores here in Oregon. And I don't see that stopping anytime soon. So that's another consideration. But I think what I like to focus on is using the waste products, I guess. So, I mean, to me, it's crazy that there's these berries harvested, they throw away the fruit, and then they bring them in hundreds and hundreds of tons, and then they burn them at 400 to 500 degrees, and then everybody drinks it. I'm talking about coffee, and there's acrylamides in there, and that's a toxin. It's very acidic, but I'm not going to, who am I to judge? Everybody, likes their stimulant and whatnot, but I could take all the coffee grounds and use that in compost. So I think you just have to kind of think outside the box and look, and the neat thing, I guess, that I would like to see is people use their own solutions as opposed to, getting some store-bought thing that's shipped in that's completely dead. Sure, that's going to generate some revenue for the producer and whatnot, but you're also getting all that plastic, and there's the shipping and all the rest of it. And you could be establishing local ties with your community and using all your waste. To me, that makes a lot more sense. And you just have to look at it very closely, because you could have veganics. You have to stay away from GMO soy. You have to watch out for cottonseed that's super contaminated with pesticides. You have to keep your eye, no matter what you decide, you have to really investigate it thoroughly.
Damned if you do and damned if you don't. We're going to take a short break and be right back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. Businesses everywhere are constantly striving to reach out to people through advertising. We all know, though, that trying to reach a cannabis audience with a quality message is pretty difficult. That's why many people choose to advertise on the Shaping Fire podcast. Advertising on this show allows us time to talk about your product, service, or brand in a way that really lets people know what sets your company apart from others. Bold people who own companies know that getting into a relationship with their customers is essential. That is what we offer. We will explain your service or product and what sets it apart as desirable and help our audience get in contact with you. It's pretty simple, really. Advertising does not have to be all whiz-bang, smoke, and mirrors. Nowadays, I find that people prefer just to be spoken to calmly, accurately, and with good intentions. If you want to make your own commercial spot, you can do that too. Because the podcast is young, but growing at an exceptionally fast rate, if you become an advertiser on the Shaping Fire podcast now, you are going to pay a fraction of the cost we'll be asking for in just a few months. And yet everyone listening both now and to the back catalog of interviews later will hear about your company again and again for years. It's a great deal for you. Pay a small amount now because the show is new, but take advantage of the huge listening audience we will have forever. Do yourself a solid and contact us today for rates on podcast and newsletter advertising. Email hotspot@shapingfire.com to find out more. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I'm your host, Shango Los, and our guest this week is legendary probiotic grower and High Times writer Nebu. So before the break, I really don't like how I gave what you had to say negative context. I said, damned if you do, damned if you don't, after you were talking about, making sure that your inputs were clean. And I think I took the positive thing that you were saying about building relationships with farmers, and I think I spun it the wrong way, because in the end, you weren't talking about being suspicious about everybody's inputs. You were talking more about being an active learner and getting in a relationship with your community, right?
Yeah, well, I think, and I can understand, I can empathize with your perspective, because there's a lot out there that's pretty heavy, and it's easy to get frustrated and just, it's just too much. Everything is bad, everything's poisonous or whatever. And it's challenging, living in our highly toxic environment of today. But if you evaluate everything, I still think there's paths that you can take. And to look on the positive side of it, yes, I think one of the great paths that you can take is developing those relationships. And I used your island as an example, and I think that's a neat community to draw from. And that's what you can do. And you can really personalize your approach by using all these philosophies or principles, and just applying them to your own situation. And there's really not one right way to do it. And I know a lot of times people want to just tell me the answer. How do I do this? And there's just so many ways and you can personalize it. So I think it's good for people to always be learning, always be inspecting. And ideally, you will develop those relationships and mitigate some waste in your community and optimize and build those things. So I think it can be a really positive thing, even though, again, there are challenges for sure.
And I think that it's a good time to point out, bioregionalism. I'm a big fan of wild-crafted nutrient teas, and when we do this show, I always get emails from people like, the comfrey that you talked about, with your guest that doesn't grow wild where I live. What do you have to recommend that's where I live in Kansas or wherever it may be? And I think that's kind of a good point to make, is that if you live here on Vashon Island, you're working with rabbit pellets, and oh man, we've got a tofu factory on the island, so we get tons of okara. We get lots of okara. Whereas wherever any particular grower lives, they've got to find out what the inexpensive, healthy waste products are around them to use. And I think that adds a little exclamation point to what you were saying, that it really is about where you are. Do your homework on what kind of probiotic inputs you can have, and find out what they're putting into their products so you know that you're clean. But, get in a relationship with your local business folk and find out what they're trying to get rid of.
Yeah, that makes sense. And especially when you're talking the soil medium, because that's a huge thing. I'm glad you brought it up, because what you're talking about is a little bit of the nativist argument. And you can take that to an extreme. And I really want to I'm a citizen of the world. I'm a beekeeper too. And I get a lot of, I've seen a lot of people talk about, this is native, this is invasive species. But people are really behind honeybees, even though they're not native to North America, but we would be, kind of lost without them in our current agriculture. So you have to kind of evaluate these things. Not everything's so cut and dry, but the bulk stuff, if you're talking the soils and things that are just really cost prohibitive and silly to have shipped in. I mean, if you're doing a 10,000 square foot grow or acres, you don't want to be shipping in the soil. You probably want to be working with what you've got and amending it with different things. Now, I like to draw on the entire world because I want to grow the absolute best. So sure, I'm using soil here. I'm using a lot of local ingredients, 90%. But if I'm getting some fossilized seabird guano from Peru, boom, I'll use it. Or if I'm getting some fulvic mineral from Kentucky, because there's a great organic source there, or diatomaceous earth from a mine in California, whatever it is. Neem doesn't grow here. So I use a lot of neem, whether it's neem meal or neem oil. So I'm drawing on all these resources to produce the most optimum thing, and that benefits the people. It's a fair trade, fair market type of situation. So it's benefiting people that just aren't, not just in my local community, but again, those relationships in the local community too, you can bind it all together and create kind of the best environment, the best of both worlds.
So before we wrap up, because we're almost done here, it's kind of funny. I'm like, before we wrap up, not having a show making a case for Veganics. When I was trying to find you, through a few different online forums and such, folks, knew about your High Times articles, but all anybody wanted to talk about were these strains that you had put out as a breeder, and everybody's all like, have him talk about his strains. And so why don't you take a couple minutes and just tell us about some of the strains that you put out there, and, just a little bit about you as a breeder, because I know that, I'll get emails about like, why didn't you ask him? So why don't you just share a little bit before we wrap up?
Oh, okay. That sounds like a whole nother podcast, but yeah, so I was involved, I guess, since 97, I've been breeding and developing different hybrids. Some of the ones that are out there are that Jackie O, which is a Jacqueline Orange, and there's Cherry Melon or Cherry Lime Ricky that was really popular. The Black Russian, I was the original developer of that, and some other people developed it into F2, but kind of sold it as a F1. There's been a lot of hybrids developed from mine, and then when Overgrow kind of got busted by the Canadian Mounties, I decided it would be probably best to go underground again with that. But I've never stopped breeding. I've been working on some CBD varieties now and still working on a lot that express purple, and always with a focus on the sativas, the real functional high. I've always been kind of opposed to the couch lock. Just I really need the euphoric and the working headspace. And that's been my forte. And the CBDs are really interesting too because of the legal aspects of it, and also the physiological aspects of it. And so that's been pretty exciting. And that's what I'm working on presently. So we'll see what happens. Hopefully I'm able to still make some progress. And with recreational happening more and more, I may actually be able to kind of come out of the basement and do some really big time selection with really big numbers, because again, all this stuff that I've developed has been kind of during the prohibitionist era, and it makes it difficult. to be quite frank, because you don't have the numbers that you could normally draw on. But I've still made some good progress, and I'm happy that there's folks out there that remember me or are still enjoying the hybrids that I've released over the years.
Yeah, you're both the cherry lime and the black Russian got a lot of love when I was looking for you. People were saying specifically about the black Russian, about how unique it was, and then how they had used it in their own breeding programs, because it was such a great place to start. And they were like, speaking of you in reverent tones and stuff. So yeah,
that's great.
Yeah, it was nice coming across those folks on my way to you. So anyway, we're set for today, Nebu. Thank you so much for taking time to be on the show. And, you obviously have got so much more information in you. I appreciate you coming to talk about this small area of veganics. And we'll see about having you on the show again down the line about one of the other areas that you are also an expert in.
I really appreciate the invitation and time, Shango. Thank you very much.
Nebu is a legendary breeder, probiotic grower, and high times writer. You can find out more about him at his website, nebuhybrids.com. And I'm going to spell that for you. nebuhybrids.com. You can find more episodes of the Shaping Fire podcast and subscribe to the show at shapingfire.com and on Apple iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. If you enjoyed the show, we'd really appreciate it if you'd leave a positive review of the podcast wherever you download. Your review will help others find the show so they can enjoy it too. On the Shaping Fire website, you can also subscribe to the weekly newsletter for insights into the latest cannabis news and product reviews. On the Shaping Fire website, you will also find transcripts of today's podcast as well. For information on me and where I will be speaking, you can check out shangolos.com. Does your company want to reach our national audience of cannabis enthusiasts? Email hotspot@shapingfire.com to find out how. Thanks for listening to Shaping Fire. I've been your host, Shango Los.